Let's imagine someone who decides to start a small business. Spend time preparing the product, look for clients, assume the first expenses, and work for several months trying to make the activity work. Despite the effort, the expected results do not come and it is finally forced to close. Faced with an experience like this, what do we really know? We know that business, under those conditions and during that specific period, could not be maintained. That is the fact. Everything else needs to be examined before reaching a conclusion. We could ask ourselves if the product responded to a real need, if the price was appropriate, or if enough customers became aware of the offer. It would also be necessary to review the costs, the available margin, the moment chosen to enter the market, and the possibility of there being errors that could be corrected in a second attempt. Each of these questions preserves valuable information because it allows you to study what happened. There is, however, a much quicker conclusion. I'm no good for business. A single sentence just erased almost all the variables. We no longer talk about the product, the price, the costs, the strategy, or the market. The problem seems to have shifted completely to the person. When we turn a concrete result into a personal definition, we also stop asking ourselves what we could change. The closing of a business can contain an enormous amount of information. Maybe we miscalculated the expenses. Maybe we tried to sell before sufficiently understanding the customer. Maybe we needed more capital, we used an inappropriate commercial channel, or the idea simply didn't have enough demand. All these possibilities allow us to extract some lessons. The phrase "I'm not good for business," on the other hand, hardly explains anything. There we find one of the main attractions of generalizations: they reduce complex situations to easy-to-remember conclusions. The same thing always happens to me. I never manage to finish anything. People are like that. I can't do these things. It is much easier to say one of these phrases than to examine each experience separately. The problem is that by doing so, we eliminate information that could be useful. When we think the same thing always happens to me, it's a good idea to subject that statement to a few questions. Did the same thing really happen on all occasions? What elements were repeated? What circumstances were different? Do we make the same decisions? What part depended on us and what part belonged to the environmental conditions? What could we modify in the next attempt? By examining the events in this way, what seemed like a single story begins to divide into different experiences. This does not mean that all generalizations are useless. We need them to learn. If we touch an extremely hot surface and burn ourselves, it is reasonable to learn to avoid similar situations. If we repeatedly use a trading strategy under comparable conditions and obtain poor results, we can also draw a provisional conclusion. This method is not working under these conditions. The important word is provisional. A useful conclusion must allow for changes when new data appear. We can learn from the past without turning a previous experience into a ruling on everything that will happen next. Experience should serve to adjust our decisions, not to lock us into a label. The problem begins when a conclusion ends up encompassing much more than the facts allow. Learning from an experience is one thing. Using it to establish a permanent definition about ourselves is quite another. That is why it is important to pay attention when absolute terms such as always, never, everything, nothing, or nobody appear. We don't need to eliminate them from our language, but when they form part of an important conclusion, it is worth checking whether they really describe what happened. Let's imagine that someone says, "No one listens to my proposals." Nobody? Perhaps several of your ideas have been rejected in recent weeks. That does not prove that no person ever listens to what he proposes. An initiative may have had too high a cost. Another perhaps came at an inappropriate time. A third may need more information before receiving approval. By separating the cases, a conclusion that initially seemed obvious begins to take on nuances. The same thing happens with the phrase, "I never finish anything I start." We can review our experience and we will probably find abandoned projects. But responsibilities that we did complete, problems that we managed to solve, and commitments that we maintained for months will also appear. Then we can replace a question that is practically impossible to answer, "Why do I never finish anything?" with another much more specific one. What do the projects I usually abandon have in common? Now we do have something to investigate. Maybe we start too many things simultaneously. Maybe we miscalculated the effort required. We may lose consistency when the initial enthusiasm wears off. It is also possible that certain projects stopped making sense and we decided to abandon them for a valid reason. Each explanation leads to a different answer. Something similar happens when someone says, "I have no discipline." The phrase encompasses too much. A person may be constant at work and have difficulty organizing their schedules. You can fulfill your professional commitments and postpone certain personal tasks. You can even train several times a week and fail to maintain another habit you want to incorporate. That is why it is more useful to identify the specific behavior. This week I have postponed an important task 4 times. We now have information that we can examine. What task was it? What time were we trying to do it? What were we doing instead? What obstacles appeared? Are there any modifications we can try next time? Here a fundamental difference appears. It is one thing to describe what we do and another to turn it into a definition of what we are. "I've put off this task 4 times" describes a specific behavior. "I am a lazy person" transforms that behavior into an identity. The first statement allows us to search for causes, modify conditions, and check other ways of acting. The second can lead us to think that the problem belongs to our own nature and that changing it will be much more difficult. If we want to improve a behavior, we need to identify what we can really intervene on. And this criterion should not be used solely to review unfavorable conclusions. We must also apply it when the opinion we have about ourselves is favorable. Positive labels can distort our analysis in the same way as negative ones. Imagine, for example, someone convinced that they make excellent decisions when working under pressure. That confidence can serve you well. But it can also become the beginning of another mistake. But if you start considering that ability as an infallible quality, confidence can end up working against you. "I function well with pressure. I don't need to review this as much." Such an idea seems to convey security, but it can also become an excuse to reduce checks. The person stops reviewing certain details because they are too confident in their ability to react when problems arise. And precisely that security can cause you to overlook information that you would have detected with a more careful review. Something similar happens with someone who says, "I know what a person is like from the first minute." Years of experience may have allowed you to recognize certain behaviors quickly. You may detect gestures, ways of responding, or attitudes that other people take longer to notice. All of this can provide useful clues. But a first impression is still a first impression. A pleasant conversation alone does not prove that someone is trustworthy. In the same way, an uncomfortable encounter does not show that we are dealing with a person we cannot trust. The initial impression can serve as a first reference. It will then have to be compared to that person's actual behavior over time. Thinking accurately also means being willing to revise the favorable opinions we hold about our own abilities. It is not about lowering ourselves or looking for defects where there are none. It is about preventing a label, favorable or unfavorable, from replacing the observation of the facts. Therefore, in many situations it is more useful to abandon for a moment the question about what kind of person we are and focus on much more concrete questions. What did I do? What result did it produce? What information do I have? What can I correct? And what is worth keeping? When we frame the problem this way, we stop dealing with an abstract definition of ourselves and start working with behaviors that we can actually observe and modify. We can also make mistakes when evaluating our abilities favorably. A pleasant opinion about ourselves does not become true just because it makes us feel good. It needs to be tested in the same way as any other conclusion. That is why the objective is not to replace a negative label with a positive one. We don't need to stop thinking, "I'm bad at doing this," to convince ourselves that "I'm great at doing this." Between both extremes there is a much more useful way to describe our situation. I still have difficulties in this part. I have improved here. I need to practice this more. Under these conditions I usually get better results. These statements contain concrete information. They allow us to observe progress, locate difficulties, and decide what deserves more practice. The problem takes on another dimension when a conclusion about ourselves has been with us for so many years that we stop recognizing it as an interpretation. It is beginning to seem like a permanent feature of our identity. Let's imagine someone who has been saying for a long time, "I've never been good at public speaking." Perhaps that conclusion began many years ago, after a bad experience during an exhibition. He got nervous, forgot part of what he wanted to explain, and ended up feeling embarrassed in front of others. Then he summed up the whole experience in one sentence: "Public speaking is not my thing." The situation ended, but the conclusion remained. Years passed, and every time an opportunity arose to address other people, that old idea presented itself again. I know how this ends. Thus a circle can form that is difficult to notice from within. The person thinks that they do not know how to speak in public and, because of that belief, they avoid practicing. By avoiding the practice, you also do not sufficiently develop that capacity. The lack of subsequent experience then seems to confirm the conclusion I had established years ago. But there is a question that deserves to be examined. Does that conclusion continue to describe that person's current ability? We may not even be able to respond. If you have avoided testing yourself for years, you have very little recent information to know. Then we can replace the old sentence with a more concrete investigation. What current facts support this conclusion? When was the last time you tried to speak in front of other people? Are there situations in which I can express myself fluently in front of a group? Am I describing my present ability or an experience that occurred many years ago? And what would happen if you trained this skill for several months? These questions do not guarantee that we will discover an unknown facility. Speaking in front of large groups may continue to be difficult even after you practice. The difference is that now we will be evaluating our present capacity instead of obeying a conclusion built at another stage of our life. An experience can teach us something about who we were at a certain time. It does not have to describe all our subsequent stages. When we learn to limit our conclusions to what the facts really allow, our relationship with errors also changes. A failure stops automatically becoming. This shows who I am. And it can mean. This shows what happened and what I need to check. Something similar happens with successes. A good result also does not demonstrate that we have mastered a certain skill forever. He informs us that something worked on that occasion. The next job is to discover which factors contributed to the result and which ones we can reproduce. But the ideas we have about ourselves do not come only from our own experiences. Many come from outside. Family, friends, teachers, coworkers, and professional groups also participate in building expectations about those who are part of their environment. Sometimes those expectations are expressed directly. You've always been the shy one. You are the one who never takes risks. That's not for people like us. On other occasions, no one needs to formulate them in such an obvious way. They are transmitted through jokes, comparisons, comments, and small reactions that are repeated for years. Let's imagine that someone has been considered from a young age as the reserved one in his family. When you remain silent during a meeting, no one is surprised because your behavior matches the role that everyone knows. But one day he participates more, tells several stories, and maintains conversations for a good part of the meeting. Then someone comments, "How talkative you are today." The phrase may seem completely innocent. At the same time, it indirectly remembers what behavior others consider typical of that person. If this kind of response is repeated for years, something interesting can happen. There comes a time when you no longer need anyone to remind you what your role is. The person himself begins to behave in accordance with the character that the group has long attributed to him. This mechanism can also influence our aspirations. A person can grow up constantly hearing that certain goals are too difficult, that certain projects require skills they do not possess, or that some opportunities belong to people from other backgrounds. After hearing these ideas for years, you may stop perceiving them as the opinions of your environment. Start using them as criteria to decide what is worth trying. In this way, a possibility can be ruled out before there is even a real attempt to verify it. That is why it is not enough to review the labels we construct about ourselves. It is also advisable to examine those that we have received from the groups to which we belong. Some may describe behaviors that we have maintained for a long time. Others may contain a grain of truth. And others may rely on older versions of us that no longer represent our current situation. An external expectation can describe how we have behaved until now. What it cannot do is decide in advance how far we are capable of developing. The ability to imagine situations that have not yet occurred can become a practical tool when used as part of preparation. Its usefulness does not consist in assuming that what we mentally represent will end up happening because we want it intensely enough. Imagining money does not produce income, just as thinking for hours about an opportunity does not make it appear on its own. What we can do is use our imagination to anticipate situations, detect difficulties, and arrive better prepared when acting. Let's think about a professional who must make an important presentation to the directors of his company. During the previous days, I could imagine the end of the meeting. He sees himself finishing his presentation successfully, observes a favorable reaction among attendees, and anticipates the recognition he hopes to obtain. That image may temporarily boost your confidence, but it leaves the main question unanswered. What will you need to do during the presentation to increase your chances of getting that result? Because between the beginning of the meeting and that imagined outcome there is an entire process. You will need to explain your arguments in an understandable way, maintain a coherent structure, and answer questions that you may not be able to fully anticipate. You may lose track of an explanation for a few seconds, encounter an unexpected objection, or discover that a part of your presentation takes more time than expected. That is why it is much more useful to imagine the execution than to limit ourselves to contemplating the outcome. The professional can mentally go through the presentation from the beginning. You can imagine yourself entering the room, placing the necessary materials, and starting with the first ideas you have prepared. You can then move through the different points of the presentation and identify those moments when you will need to slow down to better explain a complex issue. During that tour, a difficult question appears from one of the managers. Here the exercise changes. You don't need to imagine a brilliant answer delivered perfectly. You can focus on the procedure you will follow when a similar situation arises. Listen to the complete question, make sure you have understood what is being asked, organize the available information and respond only to what you know. If during this rehearsal you discover a question for which you do not yet have a sufficiently prepared answer, you have just found a gap before entering the meeting. Now you can investigate it. You could also imagine that, in the middle of an explanation, you lose track of what you were saying for a few seconds. What would I do then? You can prepare a simple reference that allows you to return to the main point, briefly refer to your notes, or return to the last idea developed before continuing. The goal is not to mentally construct a flawless presentation. It is to think about what you will do when reality deviates from the planned course. A slide might not appear. An unexpected question could disrupt the order of the presentation. One of the attendees could question a figure. An explanation that seemed simple during preparation could raise doubts and require more time. Anticipating these possibilities does not mean expecting something to go wrong. It means recognizing that a real situation allows for different developments and that some responses can be prepared in advance. This type of essay also offers an advantage that is difficult to obtain by only imagining the final success. It allows for the discovery of concrete deficiencies. If during the representation of a question the professional discovers that they do not know the answer, they already know what they need to study. If an explanation turns out to be confusing even while you try to formulate it alone, you still have time to reorganize it. If you find that you need to constantly look at the slides to remember what to say, you can try giving the presentation without them and see how well you really know the content. You can even rehearse different routes. What would I do if I had less time than expected? Which parts would you keep if you had to shorten the presentation? What information should I know by heart? What issues could I leave for a later conversation? Each of these questions turns an imagined situation into a practical decision. In this way, imagination stops being used solely to contemplate what we want to achieve and begins to function as a rehearsal space. It does not replace practice. It does not replace knowledge. It also does not eliminate the unforeseen. Its function is to help us find them sooner, when we still have time to prepare a response. Imagining a situation is really useful when that exercise allows us to discover something we need to study, practice, check, or modify before facing it. At that moment, imagining stops being a way of waiting for the result and becomes a tool to better prepare the action. There is also no guarantee that the actual situation will develop in the way we had anticipated. Questions, difficulties, or circumstances may always arise that were left out of our preparation. The advantage of having imagined different scenarios is not to eliminate those possibilities, but to arrive at the moment to act with more resources to respond when something deviates from the plan. Imagining a favorable outcome can give us confidence for a time. Mentally going through the process offers something different. It allows us to study what we will do to get closer to that result. Instead of using our imagination only to contemplate where we want to go, we can use it to examine the route. What difficulties could arise? What would we do before them? What information do we need to know? Where are we most vulnerable to making a mistake? Is there anything we can prepare beforehand? Seen in this way, the imagination functions as a space where we can explore possible situations before finding ourselves faced with them. But there is an important condition. An imagined scenario remains a possibility, not a prediction. The ability to construct an extremely detailed scene in our minds does not prove that that scene is more likely to occur. We can imagine with great realism that a meeting will end badly. We can anticipate every response, every gesture, and every uncomfortable moment until we feel like we have practically lived the situation. None of that shows that it will happen. We can also do the opposite. We can build a favorable scene in which everything works according to our wishes, people accept our proposals, and we get what we expected. The level of detail does not make that possibility a future fact either. Therefore, when a decision can produce important consequences, what we imagine needs to be compared with information from outside. The available data, previous experience, observation, and tests carried out under real conditions serve to correct what our mind may have assumed without sufficient basis. This relationship between imagination and expectation connects directly with the mechanisms of suggestion that we have been examining. A statement from another person can provide the starting point with which we begin to construct a situation that does not yet exist. Let's imagine that we are about to go to a job interview and someone tells us, "Be careful. The person doing the interviews is very aggressive." It is possible that, from that comment, we begin to anticipate the meeting. We imagine questions asked harshly. We think of defensive responses. We anticipate awkward moments and begin to interpret the interview as a confrontation before we have even met the person who will be in front of us. The initial suggestion just influenced our expectation. Now let's think about the opposite case. Someone assures us, "Don't worry. You're practically hired." An advanced performance can also begin here. We see ourselves getting the position, we think about joining, and we may even begin to behave as if the decision has already been made. The two situations start from different messages and produce different expectations. But they share a fundamental characteristic: none of them is yet the fact. The person in charge of interviewing us could appear cordial despite what we had been told. He could also reject us even if someone was convinced that our hiring was assured. The actual interview hasn't happened yet. That is why it is important to distinguish between the information we receive, the scene that our mind builds from it, and what finally happens. In the moments before a demanding situation, we can use that difference to our advantage. Instead of devoting all our attention to wondering how we want it to end, we can direct it toward what we will have to do as the situation unfolds. What do I want to communicate? What information do I need to have prepared? What questions could you ask me? What will I do if an objection appears that I was not expecting? What points do I need to check before making a decision? What can I do if the conversation goes in a different direction? These questions move our attention from an outcome that we do not yet control to actions on which we can intervene. Mental rehearsal does not guarantee that everything will go according to our plans. It also does not eliminate unforeseen events. Its usefulness is to help us discover what we need to prepare, what difficulties might arise, and what responses are worth practicing. Only imagining the result can fuel an expectation. Mentally walking through the process can reveal what we still need to learn, organize, or check. This difference can be easily seen when we have to face a difficult conversation with a collaborator, a partner, or anyone with whom we have an important disagreement. We can spend hours imagining an argument in which the other person responds in the worst possible way, rejecting every argument and transforming any explanation into a new reason for confrontation. After replaying that scene several times in our minds, we can begin to experience its effects before the conversation has even occurred. We arrive tense. We interpret certain gestures as signs of confrontation. We prepare defensive responses. And perhaps we begin to respond to intentions that the other person has not yet shown. At that moment, the imagined scene is already influencing our behavior. The problem was not considering the possibility of a difficult conversation. Anticipating difficulties can be helpful. The problem appears when we stop treating that representation as a possibility and begin to behave as if we already know what the other person will do. A more useful preparation would follow another path. We may consider that the conversation might become difficult and wonder what we will do if it happens. How will we explain our position without diverting the main issue? What information do we need to have available? What questions should we ask before responding? What points are we willing to negotiate? And what issues do we need to keep separate to prevent several disagreements from ending up mixed in a single discussion? Now the imagination is not trying to guess the conversation. He's helping us prepare it. The same capacity for anticipation can be used in a much more profitable way. Instead of constructing a single version of the conversation and assuming that will be the one that ends up happening, we can consider several possibilities. The other person might be receptive. You might agree with some of our arguments and disagree with others. You may raise an objection that we hadn't considered. Or perhaps the conversation ends up being more complicated than anticipated. Thinking about these possibilities allows us to review and advance the data we need to explain, identify reasonable objections that might arise, and prepare responses that help us keep the main issue on the table without automatically interpreting each disagreement as a personal attack. We can also decide before the meeting which issues allow for negotiation and which require maintaining a clear position. This preparation is especially useful because it avoids having to set all our boundaries while we are immersed in the discussion itself. We can even contemplate a situation in which tension increases to the point of preventing the conversation from continuing to be productive. If we have previously considered that possibility, we can have a simple response ready, stop the meeting for a few minutes, regain calm, and continue when both parties can return to focusing on the issue they need to resolve. The important difference is not to fill our minds with favorable thoughts and expel any adverse possibilities. A complicated situation can also be usefully imagined. The question is what we do with it. If anticipating a difficulty allows us to prepare a response, review information, or establish an alternative, that representation is fulfilling a practical function. The problem appears when we turn a possibility into a prediction and begin to behave as if what we imagined had already happened. For this reason, thinking about possible difficulties should not be confused with provoking them. Considering that something can go wrong does not make it go wrong. In many activities, anticipating failures is precisely a necessary part of preparation. Let's imagine the person responsible for organizing an important event. There are technical teams, suppliers, schedules, guests, and different tasks that need to be coordinated. The person in charge could avoid thinking about any problems and trust that everything will work according to the established program. But you may also ask yourself, what would happen if the main technical equipment fails? Thinking about that possibility does not increase the chances that the machines will stop working. What you can do is take it to check the equipment before the event, verify the connections, and have an alternative that allows you to continue if a breakdown appears. The same logic can be applied to delivery times. If a significant part of the event depends on a supplier, there is a possibility of a delay. Considering it does not cause delay. It can serve to introduce a safety margin into the schedule or look for an alternative before the problem exists. The usefulness of anticipating a difficulty depends, therefore, on what we do after having considered it. If we think about a problem and don't come up with a decision, maybe we're just worrying. If we think about that same problem and discover a reasonable measure we can take, anticipation becomes preparation. At the opposite extreme, we find another error. A person can spend an enormous amount of time imagining favorable outcomes without transforming those images into actions. You can see yourself running a thriving company. You can imagine excellent facilities, numerous clients, and the financial stability you hope to achieve. You can even represent in great detail what your life would be like if that project worked. That vision can help you identify a direction you are interested in pursuing. But between imagining a company and building a company that really works, there is a considerable distance. Mental representation does not create a product. It does not show that there are interested clients. Does not develop the necessary technical skills. Does not calculate costs. Does not get financing. It does not solve the problems that will appear during execution. All of this belongs to the realm of action. Imagination can show us a possibility that we are interested in exploring. Then we need to convert that possibility into questions capable of guiding us. What knowledge do I need to acquire? What resources are really necessary? What can I do with the resources I already have? What would be the first reasonable test? What do I need to check before investing a larger amount? What risks can I take without compromising the rest of my responsibilities? What would have to happen to decide that the idea needs to be modified? Now that future image begins to transform into something we can investigate. Instead of limiting ourselves to thinking about a finished company, we can try to get the first customers. Instead of imagining large installations, we can first check whether there is sufficient demand. Before committing a significant amount of money, we can run a smaller test that gives us real information. In this way, aspiration begins to produce decisions. This approach becomes even more important when we are considering a major professional or financial change. Suppose a new job opportunity appears. We could focus only on what we hope to gain: better income, new responsibilities, or greater possibilities for growth. But we can also mentally go through different scenarios. What would change in our daily lives? How long would the new job take? What responsibilities would we have to reorganize? What advantages would we lose by abandoning our current situation? Is there an adjustment period during which our income might be lower? Do we have enough resources to get through it? We can also consider the possibility that the transition may take longer than expected. If we need several months to get new opportunities, it is important to know how long we can sustain our expenses without being forced to hastily accept any alternative. If a new activity requires an initial investment, we need to determine how much we can allocate to it without compromising other important obligations. Thinking about these scenarios does not mean looking for reasons to give up change. We can also discover the opposite. Perhaps by examining the risks we will verify that they are acceptable. Maybe we have more margin than we thought. An opportunity that initially seemed too uncertain may even turn out to be reasonable after studying its conditions in more detail. The goal is not to use our imagination to convince us to move forward or to convince us to go back. It consists of using it to formulate better questions before deciding. No planning can show us in advance all the details of what will happen. There will always be circumstances that we will only know when we come into contact with the real situation. That is why imagination does not replace experience. It prepares us to reach it in better conditions. When a mental representation leads us to check a piece of information, practice an answer, reserve resources, prepare an alternative, or take a first test, it is no longer just an image of the future. It has become preparation for what we will have to do in the present. Imagination can become a rehearsal space where we explore situations before facing them. We can go down different paths, anticipate difficulties, and think about what we would do if any of those circumstances were to arise. But throughout this exercise, it is important to maintain a fundamental distinction. What we imagine is a possibility, not a prediction. Our mind has an enormous capacity to construct detailed and convincing scenes. We can imagine a failure with such intensity that for a few minutes it seems close to us. We can also represent a future success with such a level of detail that we feel like we are much closer to achieving it than we really are. None of these sensations alone inform us of the real probabilities. Just because we can easily imagine that something will go wrong does not prove that it will happen. And the fact that we can see a favorable result with enormous clarity does not show that we are close to achieving it. The scene exists in our mind. The events have not yet occurred. For this reason, the greater the consequences of a decision, the more important it is to contrast our anticipations with information from reality. We can review the available data. Observe similar situations. Consult previous experiences. Check certain assumptions. And, when possible, conduct a limited test before committing a larger amount of time, money, or resources. Suppose we are considering launching a new service. We can imagine that it will be very well received and that many clients will be willing to hire it. That possibility may be interesting, but we still need to check something essential: if these people really exist and if they are willing to pay for what we want to offer them. A test with a small group of clients can provide us with more information than entire weeks imagining how the market will react. We could also anticipate the opposite scenario and think that no one will be interested. But again, we would have a hypothesis, not a fact. The answer will appear when we confront our idea with real people. Thus, the imagination proposes scenarios and experience begins to discard, modify, or confirm them. This relationship between what we anticipate and what we later verify connects directly with the ideas we receive from other people. On many occasions, a comment is enough for our mind to begin to construct a situation that does not yet exist. Let's imagine that we are about to go to a job interview and someone warns us. The person conducting the interviews is usually quite hostile. From a few words we can begin to build an entire scene. We imagine questions asked harshly. We think about uncomfortable moments. We prepare defensive responses. We can even anticipate gestures or attitudes of someone we have not yet met. When we finally get to the interview, we don't go in with just our professional preparation. We also carry that expectation with us. And that expectation can influence our way of interpreting what happens. A demanding question could seem like a confirmation of what we had been told, even though it is part of the normal selection procedure. A serious gesture could take on meaning it may not have. The opposite can also happen. Before the interview, someone assures us, "The hiring is practically decided." Now the mental scene changes. Maybe let's imagine a simple conversation. We can assume that our incorporation is very likely and even reduce our preparation because we think that the decision has already been made. The two suggestions produce different expectations. One prepares us for a possible confrontation. The other can generate security that is not yet supported by facts. But none determines what will happen. The person who had been described to us as hostile could behave in a completely professional manner. And a hiring presented as almost certain could still depend on other candidates, an internal authorization, or a decision that we do not know. That is why it is convenient to separate three elements that we often end up mixing: what they have told us, what we have imagined from it, and what we can verify directly. The first two things can influence our expectations. The third begins to provide us with information about the situation that is really before us. This separation is especially important when we are about to face a demanding situation. In those moments, we can spend a lot of energy thinking about how we want everything to end. We can also do the opposite and spend hours worrying about what could go wrong. In both cases, our attention remains trapped in an outcome that does not yet exist. We can use that same capacity for anticipation in a different way. What information do I need to master before starting? What part depends directly on me? What reasonable difficulties might arise? What can I prepare now? What will I do if the first plan doesn't work? What resources will I need if circumstances change? What new information would require me to modify my answer? These questions are not intended to discover the future. They try to prepare us to respond when it arrives. If we are about to have a negotiation, we can review the data we need to know and decide in advance what conditions we can accept. If we are going to start a project, we can identify the essential resources and think about what alternative we will use if one of them fails. If we have to make an important economic decision, we can study what would happen in various scenarios and check what losses we could bear without compromising our situation. Then will come contact with reality. Some of the possibilities we had considered will not appear. Others will emerge in a different way. And we will probably encounter circumstances that we had never contemplated. That does not invalidate the preparation. His purpose was never to write in advance everything that was going to happen. Its function was to expand our response capacity. In this way, the imagination stops trying to guess what we do not yet know and begins to play a much more concrete function. We can imagine several possibilities. Prepare for those that deserve attention. And then observe. Because in the end it will be the facts, and not the intensity with which we had imagined a scene, that will show us what situation we really have before us. There is a point at which continuing to prepare stops improving a decision and starts preventing us from checking it. That limit is not always easy to recognize. While we study, organize information or refine a proposal, we have the feeling of moving forward. And in many cases we really are. Researching the market, calculating expenses, practicing a skill, comparing alternatives, or consulting someone with experience can avoid costly mistakes. The difficulty appears when each answer generates a new condition that we want to solve before starting. First, we think that we need to know the market better. Then we want to perfect the proposal. Later, we decided to study the competition. We then considered it necessary to modify the presentation. When we finished, we found another aspect that could be improved. And so we can spend months working on an initiative without having yet verified one of the most important issues. What happens when we put it in front of a real person? There is information that we can obtain through study. Another only appears when we act. Let's say someone wants to offer a specialized service to small businesses. Before you start, you need to know your expenses, define what problem you intend to solve, and establish reasonable conditions for offering your work. Until then, preparation fulfills a specific function. But that person could continue for weeks trying to decide what the perfect presentation will be, what name they will use, how they should organize each section of their page, or what would be the best way to explain all the details of the service. Meanwhile, he still hasn't spoken to a single prospective client. At that point, you could get more information by having 5 real conversations than by spending another 3 weeks modifying documents. You may discover that customers don't understand the proposition as you expected. What you considered its main advantage may hardly be of interest. The opposite could also happen. A feature you had treated as secondary turns out to be precisely what some people would be willing to pay for. None of this could be known with sufficient precision from a work table. It was necessary to contrast it. That is why an especially useful question during any preparation process is: what uncertainty am I trying to resolve now? If we can answer precisely, it may make sense to continue investigating. We need to know an important cost. Check a contractual obligation. Understand a technical feature. Compare two alternatives that could significantly change the decision. In those cases, obtaining additional information may modify our behavior. But let's imagine that we have been looking for opinions on an issue for several days and none of them really change what we are going to do. We consulted one more source. Then another. We ask another person. We review our notes again. And we continue without acting. Then it may be useful to ask a second question. What would I have to discover to change my decision? If we are not able to identify any concrete information that would do so, perhaps we are no longer seeking knowledge to decide. Perhaps we are waiting to feel a security that no research can provide us. Here there is an important difference between a doubt that can be resolved by studying and another that can only be resolved through a test. If we want to know how much it costs to manufacture a product, we can investigate it. If we want to know certain obligations of a contract, we can review them before signing. If we need to master a technique to correctly perform a job, we can practice it. But if we want to find out if 10 potential clients will be interested in our proposal, there will come a time when we will have to talk to them. We can study your sector for months. That does not replace his answer. The action introduces new information. And that information modifies the next action. Let's suppose that we present our service to 5 potential clients and none accept. That does not immediately show that we should abandon the project. Now we have something that we didn't have before, 5 concrete experiences that we can investigate. Why did they reject the proposal? Did the problem we were trying to solve really matter to them? Did you understand what we were offering? Did you consider the price high? Were you already using another solution? Are we talking to the right people? Each answer can modify the next attempt. Perhaps we will discover that the service is of interest, but our way of presenting it generates confusion. So we modify the explanation and try again. The explanation may be correct, but the price may be difficult to justify. We review the offer. Or perhaps we discover something more important. The problem we intended to solve is not relevant enough for those people. In that case, continuing to refine the same proposal might make less sense than reviewing the initial idea. This is how a different process begins to form. Prepare. To try. Observe. Correct. Try again. Preparation no longer occurs only before acting. It also appears after each contact with reality, using the information obtained during the previous attempt. This approach also allows controlling the size of errors. We don't need to bet all our resources to learn. We can ask ourselves what is the smallest action capable of providing us with relevant information. Before manufacturing 100 units, we can test 10. Before contracting expensive infrastructure, we can check if there is sufficient interest. Before abandoning an activity that sustains our income, we can study whether the new initiative manages to produce results during a limited period. The objective of a first test does not have to be to demonstrate that our idea works. It can simply serve to discover which part of our idea was wrong. And that information has value. Because there is a huge difference between making a mistake after committing an amount that is difficult to recover and discovering a mistake through limited testing that we can modify. Experience is no substitute for thought. Completes it. We think to decide what is worth trying. We act to obtain information that we do not yet possess. And we return to the analysis with data that was not available before. In this way, preparing and acting are no longer two opposing stages. They begin to function as parts of the same process. Preparation gets us to the point where we can perform a reasonable test. The test shows us something we didn't know. And what we discover determines what we must prepare, modify, or discard before the next attempt. Mental independence is rather about learning to examine influences before turning them into your own conclusions. We can listen to a recommendation, consider a warning, or pay attention to another person's experience without immediately assuming that it also describes our situation. Let's imagine that we are thinking about starting a professional activity and someone close to us tells us, "Many people have already tried that and almost no one manages to make a living from it." We can react in several ways. One possibility would be to accept the statement as a definitive conclusion and abandon the idea before investigating it. Another would be to reject it solely because it contradicts what we want to do. But there is a third, much more useful option, turning that statement into questions. What difficulties did these people encounter? How many do we really know? Did they try to develop the same type of activity? Did they have similar resources? At what point did they do it? What mistakes did they make? Is there information that allows us to verify this? The warning then stops functioning as an order and begins to provide us with a direction to investigate. We may discover that the person was right about an important part of what they said. There may be a difficulty that we had not considered and that we need to resolve before moving forward. We might also discover that he was generalizing from 2 or 3 close experiences. In both cases, we have obtained something useful because we neither accept nor reject the idea automatically. We examine it. This criterion should also be applied when we receive messages that coincide with what we want to hear. Suppose we are evaluating an investment and someone assures us that it is an excellent opportunity. The statement can be especially compelling if it comes from a person we respect. But our sympathy toward the speaker does not answer the fundamental questions. What are we buying? Where does the expected benefit come from? What could make the operation go wrong? How much can we lose? What information does the person who recommends us participate have? Do you have any interest in our decision? Trust can tell us that someone is worth listening to. It doesn't automatically turn all your statements into facts. And here we find an issue that runs through everything studied so far. The origin of an idea and the quality of an idea are different matters. A correct statement can come from someone we dislike. A wrong statement can come from a person we admire. We can also find a good recommendation expressed in a clumsy way and a bad recommendation presented with enormous confidence. That is why we need to continually return to what we can verify. What do we know? What are we assuming? What information are we missing? And what test could help us distinguish between the two? These questions become especially important when an idea begins to produce consequences in our decisions. Not every opinion we hear is worth extensive research. During any given day, we receive hundreds of comments that have little importance for our lives. But when a statement can influence a relevant economic, professional, or personal decision, taking time to verify it can prevent us from acting based solely on an impression. Suppose someone receives a proposal to participate in a project. The presentation is convincing. The people involved transmit security. The forecasts seem favorable. All of this constitutes information, but it still does not answer essential questions. We can study the costs. Review the obligations we would assume. Check what part of the forecasts comes from existing results and what part depends on estimates. We can also analyze what would happen if income took longer than expected or if certain expenses ended up being higher than estimated. This analysis is not intended to demonstrate in advance that the proposal is good or bad. It aims to reduce the distance between the initial impression and what we really know. Then it will be time to decide. And even after carrying out a responsible investigation, we can make mistakes. That fact does not necessarily invalidate the process used. A reasonable decision can produce an adverse result because there are circumstances beyond our control. Likewise, a decision made without sufficient foundation can end up working favorably. That's why evaluating our decisions solely by their outcome can teach us the wrong lessons. Let's imagine that someone risks an amount of money that they could not afford to lose on a trade that they had barely studied. You are lucky and you make a profit. If you conclude that you made a great decision solely because you made money, you can repeat the same behavior by increasing the risk more and more. The result was favorable. The procedure used to decide continues to have defects. The opposite can also happen. A person carefully studies an opportunity, limits the amount he can lose, considers various scenarios, and finally decides to take a test. Then a circumstance that is difficult to foresee appears and the operation produces a loss. The result was adverse. That does not by itself prove that all of the above reasoning was incorrect. We need to study both things separately. How we decided and what happened next. This separation allows learning with much more precision. We can review whether we used enough information, whether we ignored any relevant signals, whether we appropriately calculated the consequences, and whether our expectations were reasonable given the data available at the time. Then we can observe the result and discover what new information appeared. This way we avoid two opposite errors. We do not turn every success into a demonstration that we are always right. Nor do we transform every setback into proof of disability. The results become information. And when we use that information to review our previous decisions, we complete the cycle that we have been building throughout this journey. We receive ideas. We examine them. We construct a provisional interpretation. We prepare. We act. We observe what happened. And we return to our conclusions to check which ones continue to be useful and which ones need to be modified. Thinking for yourself does not mean always having a ready answer. It means retaining the ability to revise what we believe when sufficient reasons appear to do so. Accumulated experience does not eliminate the possibility of making mistakes, but it can improve the quality of the questions we ask before making a decision. Over time, we begin to recognize what information we need to verify, what assumptions should be tested, and what signals deserve our attention before committing resources, time, or effort. We also learn that not all mistakes require the same response. Some indicate that we should practice a skill. Others show that we miscalculated a variable, chose an inappropriate strategy, or started from an incorrect assumption. On certain occasions, the problem will not be in the execution, but in the direction we had chosen. Therefore, after an adverse result, it is not enough to propose trying harder. First, we need to find out what produced the result. Let's imagine that a person offers a new service and barely gets any clients. You might conclude that you need to work more hours and immediately increase your trading efforts. But first, it would be advisable to study what happened. Did people understand what you offered? Did the service solve a problem they considered important? Did the price correspond to the value they perceived? Did the proposal reach those who could really need it? Was there initial interest that later disappeared? The answers could lead to completely different decisions. If there is interest but the explanation is confusing, the way the service is presented will have to be improved. If potential customers fully understand the proposal but do not consider the problem you are trying to solve important, increasing the number of hours spent selling it may not solve the main difficulty. Acting gives us results. Analyzing them converts those results into information. And using that information to modify our next decision is what allows the experience to produce learning. This process also prevents us from confusing perseverance with repetition. Persistence does not mean executing the same strategy indefinitely hoping that the result ends up changing. We can maintain a goal and often modify the way we approach it. A test can teach us that we need to change the method. Another may show that we must acquire a skill. A third may reveal that the objective requires more resources than we had estimated. And there may also come a time when accumulated information indicates that continuing down that path is no longer worth the necessary effort. Abandoning a strategy that the facts have shown to be ineffective does not necessarily mean abandoning what we wanted to achieve. We can change the path without losing sight of the purpose. In this way, criteria begin to intervene before, during, and after our actions. Before acting, it helps us study the situation and decide what deserves to be tested. During execution, it allows us to observe what is happening without depending solely on our expectations. It then helps us compare what we expected with what actually happened. Experience then ceases to be a simple accumulation of years or attempts. It begins to become organized information. And that information can be used to prepare the next decision with an understanding we didn't have before. We do not need to control all circumstances to govern our direction. What we need is to learn to observe carefully what happens, decide using the information available, act when we have a sufficient basis, and correct our decisions when the results show us something that we did not know before. We will not always be able to anticipate the response of other people, the changes in the environment, or the difficulties that will appear along the way. Nor will we be able to avoid all errors. What we can do is prevent an expectation, a foreign opinion, or an old conclusion from permanently deciding for us. We can review. We can check. We can learn. And we can change our way of acting when we find sufficient reasons to do so. In this way, each experience can contribute something to the next. A decision produces consequences. Consequences provide information. This information allows us to review our first assumptions and prepare a new response. Thus, what we learn does not remain only an idea that we know, but begins to intervene in the decisions we make. That is the point at which knowledge stops being just something we understand and begins to be part of our way of life. This journey will continue. And if you want to discover more content, projects, and new publications, you can visit MentorNoriegaIA. MentorNoriegaIA. Knowledge to understand. Criterion to decide. Action to build.